Dear students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. We will be talking here today on the course called Social Policy, and the specific module under discussion is Social Capital. My name is Sohini Sengupta and I am a faculty at the School of Social Work, the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. In this module, you will become familiar with the definitions and debates around social capital, the positive and negative aspects of the concept, and the relevance of social capital for social policy in general. Social capital has been defined in recent times as the norms, relationships, and understandings that allow individuals to form cooperative relations for mutual benefit. Now, while I'm stating a definition, there's a great deal of controversy about the term social capital, and not all theorists and all policymakers agree upon what would be the right definition for social capital. Our objective in this course is not to reach a resolution about this controversy over definition. What we will take from the concept of social capital is what is relevant for our course in social policy. Social capital has also been classified in three ways in order for easy understanding. We can describe it in terms of bonds, bridges, and linkages. Bonds essentially imply when individuals are linked through a common identity. These common identity can develop on the basis of family, kinship, ethnic membership in a group, etc. Bridges describe linkages that individuals may have with each other that go beyond a shared identity. That essentially means extra-familial relationships beyond your friends and close associates, like colleagues and distant associations. Linkages take networks of mutual cooperation beyond family and close associations to people who could be above or below the individual in the social hierarchy. Now, if that is the definition with which we begin, what we need to understand is how is this concept of social capital relevant to social policy? To begin with, let's go back to the basic question of how do individuals secure welfare in society, since the objective of social policy is to contribute towards greater welfare or well-being of individuals and citizens in a particular nation or society. Some observers argue that there are various ways in which people secure welfare. Welfare by welfare, to reiterate what has been taught to you in the previous modules, we can think about food, education, healthcare, housing, and so on. Now, welfare can be secured by individuals through purchases in the market. It can be provided to them free of cost by governments who take special care about such issues. It could also, however, be obtained by individuals by using informal social networks. Informal social networks like by relying on friends and neighbors or patrons, and sometimes even officials who are not that honest. Right? So basic welfare in modern society is never ever obtained from one particular source. It usually is procured from a variety of sources. Individuals therefore rely on multiple sources of welfare. And this is where social capital comes in. The popularity of the concept, although the term has been around for a really long time and has been fairly common in social theory literature, it became very common in popular usage with the publication of Robert Putnam's book called Bowling Alone, in which he describes how modern American societies are increasingly becoming individualized, and because of which they are losing the kind of relationship and the kind of networks that communities had previously. In other words, as individuals get wealthier and stronger, society strengthens in a particular way, but intrahuman relationships, communities wither. And this Putnam described as a loss of social capital. And hence, in the context of bowling, which is a popular sport in the United States, people no longer supported leagues. They did not play or support leagues in the neighborhood, what they did was they played individually and by themselves. We will not, however, spend a lot of time discussing social capital as defined by Putnam. What we will do is we will focus instead on another American. This is the American sociologist James Coleman, who belonged to the University of Chicago, when he theorized social capital as inherent to the structure of relationships between social actors. Coleman's understanding of social capital comes closest to how the concept can be useful for social policy. So we will restrict ourselves to this particular understanding. Social capital, according to Coleman, is a type of resource just like any other form of capital. Can you think of other forms of capital? Say, for example, physical capital or human capital or economic capital. The names are fairly understandable in today's context. It is, however, different from all these other forms of capital in being less tangible. It's not something like physical capital that you can hold and do something with. Yeah, it's not equipment, it's not an instrument, it's fairly abstract. Social capital has a specific function that makes possible certain types of outcome. It essentially means, it could mean close ties through family, community, religious affiliation that provides the insurance that is necessary to facilitate trustworthy transactions in the market. That's where Coleman began. He said if you had enough social capitals, or if individuals had access to enough amounts of social capital, then this would facilitate trustworthy relationship, which helps all kinds of transactions, including transactions in the market. Coleman illustrated the notion of social capital with a number of examples that are fairly easy to understand. Here we are not talking very specifically about social policy, but looking at human interactions generally in the society and what makes human interactions work. So Coleman discusses the wholesale diamond market in New York, and he discusses and describes a situation whereby diamond merchants would give bags of sample diamonds to other merchants to inspect for whether these were good quality or not. And in such a process, they would face immense trust on each other. What that basically implies is that if you are a diamond merchant X and you have a bag of sample diamonds, you can give it to a diamond merchant Y, and the diamond merchant Y can take it with them privately to look at it in leisure, inspect it to see if it's good quality, and return it without having stolen any of the diamonds or replacing them with artificial glass replicas. Now, how could the diamond merchants place so much trust on each other? And what is the outcome for the diamond wholesale business as such because of this kind of trust that people had on each other? The reasoning provided by Coleman for the successful functioning of the wholesale diamond market was the trust and cohesion of the diamond merchant community, who were tied by bonds of religion, kinship, and marriage. They were in effect a closed community. They knew each other, they were each other's neighbors, they belonged to the same religious community, they dined together, and hence this is the glue that enabled the wholesale market to function without anybody stealing anybody's property. Social capital, according to Coleman, as he theorizes further, is hinged on this notion of obligation and expectation. It depends on two particular elements: trustworthiness and the social environment. What does trustworthiness mean? The trustworthiness basically implies that obligations that human social actors incur on other human social actors, it will be repaid. So if you're obliged to someone, if you've borrowed money, that means that there is a general understanding that you will be returning that money at some point in time. So people will believe you, take your word for it, and loan you money in the future again. The second word, that's the social environment, shows the extent of obligation that exists in any society at that point in time. If a particular society is full of such unpaid obligations, basically it proliferates in these kinds of obligations, it essentially means that the environment is conducive for trustworthy relationships to thrive, because people can depend on each other to trust each other. Individuals in social structures that have high levels of outstanding obligation, according to Coleman, also have higher levels of social capital to withdraw upon, as against it's the analogy is actually with a bank. Basically, if you have, if you are a good bank customer, and if you've been, doing your transactions well, and if you've not done overdraft and you pay your credit card bills in time, it means the bank will trust you and in future also loan you more money. A similar kind of analogy in a social context means a society where there is a lot of unpaid debts of obligation, not just for money, but for any kind of services or goods. It essentially means that it is a good environment which can build a lot of social capital. Coleman uses another example which is closer to our context in India, which is the rotating credit system, to demonstrate how obligations and expectations create trustworthy environment. Imagine a small savings and credit group. It's not very difficult to imagine that. It's fairly common in our society, in which a group of friends and neighbors meet regularly with the objective, of course, to save money. And we can assume that none of the people are very rich and they have very small sums of money to contribute, which also means that these small sums of money are very valuable to them. You cannot do without it. Each person then goes ahead and contributes a small sum of money to this central fund. A sum from this fund then again will be paid back to each individual member of this informal group that has come into being. And how do you choose the people to whom you give back this sum of money? You draw lots, or you organize a bidding process. Eventually, after a couple of months, all of those who have contributed to the central fund will also get a payback from the group, right? Coleman argues that without a high degree of trustworthiness, a society or a group like this cannot function. Essentially, and a rotating credit system, an institution like that would not emerge in any society, essentially because a person X who receives the payment first has the full freedom, because there is no police or court or any other enforceable mechanism here. Only the word of mouth and trust can withdraw the money and just take their payment and go away. And that would mean the breakdown of the entire rotating credit system. But it does not happen. It does not happen because every single person repays and every single person waits their turn, and that's how the rotating system continues to rotate. Social capital, according to Coleman, is crucial for the successful functioning of such institutions. Now, can we get a little closer to understanding how social capital contributes to social policy? What are the other useful functions of social capital? It's a really useful thing if one can only stretch our imagination to imagine it as something as tangible as money, which is our property, right? One of the other functions of social capital is how it acts as a source of information for people. All social relations are inherently sources of information. But what is the difference between, say, reading a newspaper or watching television or going onto the internet to get news, as against relying on social networks for information? The distinction is that social relations may be maintained for different types of purposes, not for the purpose of extracting information, but the very fact that you're part of various types of social networks would mean that you're better informed than people who are not part of such social relations. So what Coleman argues is, with little investment of time or money, individuals may acquire useful information from social relations and everyday interactions which are maintained for other purposes. So it's not to think of social relations instrumentally in terms of what you can get out of it, but it's just that a lot of networks, a lot of social interaction, a lot of face-to-face interaction leads to people being more knowledgeable about many things that they would otherwise be not. Can you think of the usefulness of this concept for a society where a lot of people are actually non-literate and don't necessarily go onto the internet or newspaper for getting their information? The other idea about the other function of social capital is the use of norms as sanctions. Effective societal norms, also according to Coleman, constitutes different types of social capital. A prescriptive norm, which means if you behave in a particular way, the society rewards you. It's connected to status, honor, and reward, which essentially means that individuals in a society are persuaded to act honorably on many occasions because a community rewards it, which means certain norms, which are unspoken rules and standards in a society, work effectively. Another effect of norms could be, say for example, security in a neighborhood. When everybody knows that behaving in a particular way, say for example, drunkenness is not allowed by community members who police their neighborhood quite effectively, it also means, and that there are sanctions and you'll be asked to leave if you behave in a drunken fashion. That can mean that norms work also to constrain human actions to not act in inappropriate ways. So that is the other function of social capital. The third idea about social capital, and now we are inching closer to our understanding of social policy, is how social capital is actually public goods. It's a form of public goods. Why does social capital have a public goods quality? While social capital is an important resource for people and it influences their ability to act and brings about positive change in their society, there is a particular characteristic of social capital in the action that individual humans undertake in their society. Does not necessarily might create social capital, but then this social capital will be created for the collectivity. The good will go to the public in general, not to individuals specifically who did that particular action. Herein lies the positive thing about social capital, as well as the repercussions of being something that converts itself into something of collective good, of collective interest. What if individuals are not interested in performing actions that does not lead to tangible benefits to them right then and there? This is one of the reasons why Coleman suggests is social capital is dispersing, it's dissipating, it's getting reduced in modern societies because individuals don't see the reason why they should contribute, why they should meet other people, why they should interact, why they should develop cooperative relationships if there is no tangible benefit that comes to them, even though it might mean that trustworthiness and cooperation and all those other kinds of good things increase in the society, and which will eventually lead to good things for the individual. Coleman suggests in this situation that social capital therefore must be built through formal organizations wherever individuals are unable to create it spontaneously through their own activities. What are the positive outcomes for social policy by building social capital, for example, or encouraging people to have more social capital, encouraging people to live in stronger communities? Accumulation of social capital, according to social policy analysts, such as adherence to social norms or generalized trust, act as a catalyst to facilitate provisioning of public goods. It reduces crime levels, it lowers healthcare expenses, it enables people to be good, solid, trustworthy citizens simply because they are accountable to each other and to their local communities. And their accountability is not dependent on formal bureaucracy or police or court of law. There is simply a check and balance in the society. It encourages community members to contribute towards social capital, which will stabilize their civic participation and adherence to social norms of the network, which essentially means that people will engage in far more public spirited activities. They will indulge in participation in designing policies that are good for the community in general. Social policy implementation, and this is where we come to a point where social capital becomes really relevant for social policy. We often talk about, in the context of our country, about having really good policies, very good social programs, but the implementation being very poor because it never gets implemented well, and people don't care what kind of programs they receive, or they're too disempowered to protest about the bad quality public services that they're being offered. Social policy implementation would thrive in a community that is stable because people would be accountable to each other. They would also therefore have the strength to come together to create better outcomes from existing initiatives. The other positive outcomes are social capital building is also supposed to support healthy democracies which are founded upon active participation of citizens in both social and political spheres. If you remember our module on citizenship, we spoke about how citizenship is not just a legal status, but it's also about being actively engaged in creating public policies. Citizens are highly likely to contribute towards tax payment, adhere to laws, develop progressive social norms, and take onus of finding a solution to collective problems. And this important thing, if you remember our first social policy lecture, social policies are based on the recognition of social problems, identification of social problems, and then creating effective solutions, and then delivering these solutions to people to obtain better outcome, well-being outcome for people. Having social capital building, therefore, as some proponents argue, would lead to people coming together to devise collective solutions to the problems that they have identified themselves, leading to hopefully better outcomes. So what are the negative ideas about social capital? If everything is so good about it, then why do we have so many detractors of the concept of social capital? Some of the negative interpretations of social capital is this, again, if we have really good networks and if members of a community are so well knit together and so well connected and the network is really dense, it's not necessary that they always use these networks for purposes which are considered beneficial for the society. Basically, they're not necessarily creating redistribution or justice or equality or any of those things, remember, we spoke about in the previous module. What if they use these good networks and their solidarity for encouraging cartelization in markets? Say a group of businesses get together and they act in a fashion that actually defrauds the consumer of getting appropriate goods and services in the market. What about crime? And you've heard about crime mafias. Those are built on intense personal, interpersonal and mutually cooperative networks, right? So it can actually lead to increase and escalation in crime. Community members can also become rent seekers, and instead of paying taxes to government, they can become small governments in their own right. All of these things are not supposed to be great for the economy, and therefore detractors of social capital would say excessive amounts of social capital going in a particular direction could lead to quite different types of outcome than what social policy envisages. Social exclusion is the other negative possible outcome from having too much social capital. Take for example Old Boys Network. Old Boys Network are notorious for restricting the entry of people who are not like them. Similarly, caste system and other forms of ethnic closed groups might lead to exclusion or marginalization of community members who do not fit into these groupings. So excessive amount of social capital of a certain kind can also lead to social exclusion. It can also lead to higher crime rates instead of reducing crimes, because gang members might feel very close to each other, they can bond very well, and religious terrorist outfits can use religion as a common bond to recruit many people. Bonding social capital can become an impetus, therefore, also for illegal activities. Lower educational attainment is another reason why sometimes social capital is not a good idea. In a particular community where not too many people are educated, and also because community members want their children to pursue different types of activities, it's possible that overall all community members might land up with low educational attainment. Social networks could be the main channel through which many unhealthy practices can spread amongst young people, like drugs or smoking. All of these are based on very secretive, very almost cult-like following amongst members of group. Before we end our discussion about theoretical discussions about social capital, it's important to mention the work of the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, essentially because his understanding of social capital is so very different from both James Coleman and very far away from Robert Putnam. For the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, social capital symbolized societal inequalities and not something fantastic that bonds societies together and creates a cohesive and wonderful universe. According to Bourdieu, social capital is the sum of resources, actual or virtual, that accrue to individuals and groups by the virtue of possessing a durable network of more or less institutionalized relationship of mutual or actual recognition. And what it translates into essentially is societal hierarchy, using which elites capture all other forms of resources and continue to institutionalize their social dominance. They also use social capital as the means of excluding non-elite persons to attain social mobility. And with that, we come to an end of the module on social capital. So what did we learn in this module? What we learned in this module is essentially about the concept of social capital, how is it defined, how social capital essentially means intangible resources that societies, communities and individuals possess through mutually strong networks that they build amongst each other. Social capital could be a useful thing for social policy when these trust and networks and mutual support and cooperation leads to positive outcomes, leads to more well-being. It can be quite negative when these same bonds and networks lead to exclusion or participating in activities that do not lead to overall increase in welfare in the society. We looked primarily at the work of the social theorist James Coleman to understand the concept of social capital, and we discussed how it is relevant for social policy. You're encouraged to read the readings associated with social capital, and especially the two sources that are provided on this module to develop your understanding better about social capital. You're also encouraged to see talk about the kind of communities that you belong to and see how whether social capital is an important ingredient of how people feel about being part of these societies. Thank you.